If you go to Narita Airport in Japan, you'll see something strange. For some reason, there's a family-run farm right in the middle of the airport. But why is it there? Well, what you're seeing is the result of the longest-running riot in history and the bloodiest one in Japan. It started in 1966, and somehow it's still going, almost 60 years later. And this riot, this brutal, chaotic chapter, is directly linked to a manga that literally changed the course of Japanese history, one that affected every corner of Japanese society. Its impact, so deep, it even triggered a real airplane hijacking. And yet, in the West, almost no one knows this manga. But in Japan, it's one of the most influential works ever created. Not just in manga and anime, but in politics, culture, and society. It's been referenced for decades across multiple stories, honored with statues across the country, woven into the nation's memory. I'm talking, of course, about Ashita no Joe. So how did a 1960s boxing manga reshape an entire country? Why is it still beloved today, almost 60 years later? And more importantly, why is such a revolutionary masterpiece almost unknown in the West? Tetsuya Chiba couldn't leave those walls. Otherwise, he might die. Born in Tokyo, Japan, Chiba spent most of his early childhood in China. As a child, he lived with his family and other Japanese residents inside 4 walls he wasn't allowed to leave, no matter what. He didn't understand why he had to stay inside. All he wanted was to explore, to run, to see what was out there. Curious and full of energy, the boy often tried to sneak out when his parents weren't looking. At the time, his family was living in a Japanese printing house where his father worked. Inside, they were safe, but the world outside was a different story. You see, Chiba grew up during World War II, when much of China was under Japanese control. Tensions were high, and many Chinese people held strong anti-Japanese feelings. As a result, for Japanese families in the area, going outside could mean serious danger, even death. However, Chiba, along with his family and the rest of their neighbors, would have to leave the safety of the walls on August 15, 1945, and risk their lives after the Japanese emperor announced over the radio that Japan was surrendering to the United States, thus ending World War II. As a consequence, local Chinese began looting the homes of the people living in the printing house. At age 6, Chiba had to make the journey of more than 300 kilometers, or almost 200 miles on foot, to the port of Huludao, where a Japanese ship was receiving any Japanese who could make it there to return them to Japan. However, saying it wasn't easy would be an understatement, as if it weren't enough to survive the area's freezing temperatures, sometimes reaching minus 30 degrees Celsius or minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, unprotected eyes freeze instantly, and as if the fact that people didn't like the Japanese much for what they had done to China and its people wasn't enough, China was in the middle of a civil war. To survive, Chiba and his family constantly took shelter wherever they could, sometimes spending days in a basement with his mother and 2 brothers, unable to leave or make a sound. Meanwhile, his father had to go out and risk his life to get food. With no entertainment, his mother read them stories constantly until she ran out of books. To keep Chiba entertained and help him entertain his 2 younger brothers, she encouraged him to start drawing those stories. In Chiba's own words, "This was the beginning of my career as a mangaka." It's estimated that at that time, there were around 1 million Japanese in China. By the end of that winter, when Chiba and his family managed to reach the port of Huludao, around 200,000 of the people trying to get back to Japan had died. Getting here was hard, probably every Japanese told themselves, but once I reach my native Japan, everything will be better. I'll be able to rebuild my life as if nothing had happened. Japan was the promised land. It was that tomorrow, which constantly motivated them to keep fighting to survive. But nothing could be further from the truth. As if fate were warning of what he would have to live through later, just before arriving in Japan, Chiba lost his best friend, with whom he had been playing just hours before. And when they arrived at the promised land of Japan, what they saw was a destroyed land, with hungry people and streets of decomposing bodies. Not because no one cared that they were there, but because they themselves weren't doing much better. Every day was a constant struggle. Chiba tells how when they arrived in Tokyo, his mother's hometown, there was nothing. The place that had once had buildings, hills and valleys and people was now flat, and he could clearly see Mount Fuji, despite it being 120 kilometers or 75 miles away. You might wonder what happened to Tokyo, his mother's hometown, to be like this. After all, the nuclear bombs fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the closest to Tokyo is the latter, being more than 800 kilometers or just over 500 miles away, so the impact of the bombs didn't reach there. Well, something people forget is that the atomic bombs weren't the first devastating attacks against Japan. Long before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, entire cities had been wiped off the map by the United States. Tokyo had suffered the same fate as dozens of other Japanese cities during the incendiary bombings. Tokyo had been subjected to such an intense bombing mission that it caused a firestorm, a literal tornado of flames where more than 100,000 people died, burned alive or suffocated by smoke. The oxygen itself was absorbed by these infernal storms, turning entire cities into open-air crematoriums. By the time the atomic bombs fell in August, much of the country had already been reduced to ashes. Tokyo, Chiba's mother's hometown had simply disappeared, along with countless other places, victims of this systematic campaign of destruction by the USA that happened before the nuclear attacks. Understanding this is important because the end of the war for Japan didn't just mean the death of millions of its people, but the loss of its national pride. The physical devastation was only the beginning. When General Douglas MacArthur entered Tokyo, he didn't arrive as a vengeful conqueror, but as an architect of a new nation. The United States, armed with unconditional surrender and the power of the atom, could do whatever it wanted with Japan, and what it decided to do was something even more radical than destruction: a complete transformation of Japanese identity. The new constitution imposed by the United States not only established Japan as a liberal democracy, but went further than the American Constitution itself. It guaranteed equality between men and women, labor rights, and something revolutionary: the famous Article 9 that forever prohibited the maintenance of armed forces. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right, declared the document. But perhaps the most humiliating thing was the disillusionment of the emperor. That divine being who had guided Japan for centuries was forced to renounce his divinity and become a simple symbol, just another mortal in a country of defeated mortals. However, when the Cold War began, the United States changed the rules of the game. They no longer needed a progressive democracy. They needed a stable military base with a friendly government. War criminals were pardoned and allowed to seek political office, while communists were purged. And as the cherry on top, they imposed a treaty that allowed American troops to move freely through Japanese territory without any obligation to defend it in case of attack. This humiliation caused a massive identity crisis. Japan found itself divided among multiple factions: the conservatives of the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, who wanted to align with the United States to strengthen the nation; the communists, who wanted to reject the United States and get closer to China and Russia, their closest neighbors; and the nationalists, who wanted Japan to follow its own path, free from the influence of both the USSR and the United States. The logic was that if they joined the USA, China, and Russia, their closest neighbors would automatically become their enemies. If they did the opposite and sided with the two communist nations, the result would basically be the same. But if they chose to follow their own path, who knows how that would look? So it was basically like choosing the lesser of three evils. But which one would it be? The two most important candidates were Hayato Ikeda of the Liberal Democratic Party and Inajiro Asanuma of the Socialist Party. Ikeda was initially seen as an empty puppet, an elite economist with glasses and elegant suits who was chosen as temporary leader of the LDP because he had no real power base within the party. He had a history of political gaffes, including insensitive comments about the poor eating cheap barley instead of expensive rice, and that it didn't matter if 5 or 10 small businessmen ended their time in this world. I'm paraphrasing there for obvious reasons. Seeing what Ikeda was like, it's not surprising that people turned to the left. Inajiro Asanuma, leader of the Socialist Party, became an enormously popular figure, famous for his humble clothing and living his entire life in public housing. Asanuma connected with the people in a way that elitist conservatives couldn't. He had visited Mao Zedong in China, returning wearing the communist leader's characteristic suit, declaring his friendship with China and his opposition to the United States, which didn't please some sectors of the nation and USA. The national debate had become completely polarized. Should they expel the Americans and risk the superpowers' wrath, or maintain the humiliating alliance for security? Tokyo's streets filled with massive protests. Tens of thousands shouted, "Yankee go home!" and attacked American officials. Many believed Japan was on the verge of a socialist revolution, like so many other Asian countries were doing. But on October 12th, 1960, during a live televised debate between the prime ministerial candidates, everything changed in a second. While Asanuma was speaking before millions of viewers, a 17-year-old nationalist youth rushed onto the stage and pierced his heart with a samurai sword. The entire nation witnessed live the end of the life of the left's most popular leader. With Asanuma gone, the communists eliminated, and the nationalists discredited as bloodthirsty psychopaths, only one option remained on the table: the pro-American Liberal Democratic Party. Japan would remain intertwined with the United States for decades to come. And once again, someone else had made a decision for the Japanese people without asking for their opinion. They were just like Chiba, who had to flee Japan for his life, a child with no voice and no say in what happened to him. This experience, the betrayal of a home that turned out to be as inhospitable as exile, the loss of innocence in the face of war's brutality, survival through art and storytelling, and now the violent death of political hope, would profoundly shape Chiba's vision of the world. And years later, these experiences would become the emotional foundation of a work that would change the course of Japanese history, Ashita no Joe. But before getting to that, we need to go back a bit to see what our friend Chiba was doing. After returning to Japan, Chiba followed in his father's footsteps and began working at a printing house. It was stable, secure work, something his family desperately needed after the hardships they'd endured. But the stories he had drawn to entertain his brothers during those dark days in China wouldn't leave him. Art had been his escape, his way to survive, and now it had become something more, a calling. Little by little, Chiba began dedicating himself seriously to manga. His first works had some success, especially Harisu no Kaze, Harris's Wind, a light and cheerful series about Kunimatsu Ishida, a problematic student who discovers his athletic talent when his principal forces him to practice sports to avoid being expelled. It was exactly the type of content Japan needed at the time. Optimistic, simple, comforting. In this story, we can see the beginnings of what would later become the monster series that is Ashita no Joe, both in the protagonist's design and because it deals with a delinquent who practices sports. However, despite the success, Chiba had a reputation in the industry. He was known for being extremely sensitive, soft-hearted. His stories, though popular, lacked edge, that hardness that characterized the great manga hits. He was, in the words of some editors, too gentle to create something truly impactful. Everything changed when Chiba decided that Kunimatsu, the main character from Harisu no Kaze, should try boxing. To document himself properly, he visited a boxing gym, immersing himself in the world of fighters. What he saw impacted him profoundly. In his own words, it's basically a world war in there. Some boxers reached the heights of glory, becoming champions. Others simply got lost and were forgotten. It was a world of extremes, of triumph and devastation, of realized dreams and destroyed lives. For someone like Chiba, who had experienced firsthand the brutality of survival, this world resonated in a way he hadn't anticipated. This new fascination with boxing planted a seed in his mind for his next project, and as if destiny were playing its cards, an editor from Shonen magazine named Teruo Mihayara visited the area and organized a meeting with Chiba. "Why don't you make a boxing manga?" his editor proposed. "Right now, there's no manga that focuses purely on this sport." Chiba completely agreed with the idea, especially after his inspiring visit to the gym. But Mihayara had a condition that would change everything. "You should work with another manga author this time," Mihayara told him. "You should work with Iki Kajiwara." Chiba initially rejected the offer outright. He knew Kajiwara's reputation, and he knew they were like oil and water. Chiba described his own style as a gentle human hymn with a lyrical atmosphere. Kajiwara, on the other hand, was known for stories about pure effort and iron determination. Iki Kajiwara was a legend in the industry. Author of the acclaimed baseball manga, Star of the Giants, as well as Tiger Mask, he was famous for being incredibly proud and stubborn. There were rumors that when editors asked him to rewrite some lines of his manga, Kajiwara would respond, "No rewrites. I'm not selling my soul." To give more context, Iki Kajiwara is the mangaka of sports stories. He quite literally created the genre. What we usually call sports anime and manga is known in Japan as spokon, short for sports, and konjo, meaning guts or fighting spirit. The difference between a sports story and spokon is that the former can be a story like Space Jam, Remember the Titans, or Moneyball, where the focus isn't really on sports. These serve as a backdrop and rarely deal with physical effort, blood, sweat, and tears, the sacrifices you have to make, and constantly training until you can't anymore to improve. That's spokon. You know, series like Haikyuu, Slam Dunk, or Blue Lock. It's basically the difference between something like Mike, the movie about magic sneakers, and Rocky. In other words, what people usually think Akira Toriyama and Dragon Ball are to the battle shonen genre, Iki Kajiwara is to sports anime and manga. Chiba was a quite successful mangaka, but what his editor was proposing was like telling The Weeknd to record a song with the Beatles or Michael Jackson. Don't get me wrong, all three are good and extremely talented, but I think there's a clear difference in the impact and fame of these artists. Having this context now, it's more understandable why Kajiwara had such an inflated ego and was a man who absolutely refused to compromise his art. His vision was absolute. The idea of working with another author was, for him, unthinkable. But Mihayara, Chiba's editor, didn't give up. He knew that the combination of Tetsuya Chiba's human touch and Iki Kajiwara's raw narrative could create something bigger than the industry itself. After much insistence, Chiba finally accepted Mihayara's offer, but with his own condition. He wanted to have creative freedoms alongside Kajiwara in this potential boxing manga project. Mihayara was dismayed. He knew it would be foolish to expect the great and proud Iki Kajiwara to compromise his work with another author, but he didn't give up. He went to see Kajiwara and told him about Chiba's condition. As expected, Kajiwara immediately rejected the offer. It would have to be the great Osamu Tezuka himself, the creator of Astro Boy, Kimba, and Blackjack, he declared, to accept such a proposal. He also expressed to Mihayara that it was unthinkable that even he or Chiba could direct something that would transcend their individual work. But Mihayara had a prepared response. "I don't think so. With respect to both of you, if we give the world one more story, we might be able to do something like that." These words touched something deep in Kajiwara. The man who had refused to compromise his art for years suddenly said, "I think you've made me see the vision in your head." Kajiwara Kajiwara accepted Chiba's condition, and the duo got to work. But first, this new great story would need a name equally great. After long hours of discussion, the title for their new project seemed unattainable. Most of their recommendations simply didn't sound right for the type of story they wanted to tell. Then, suddenly, these words came out of Kajiwara's mouth: Ashita no Joe, which translates to Tomorrow's Joe. It was the perfect title for a series that revolved around the theme of seeking tomorrow, of fighting for a better future, and thus, the legendary hero was born. Ashita no Joe began its serialization in Weekly Shonen magazine in January 1968, at a time when economic and social problems were transforming Japanese culture. The manga was about a young man named Yabuki Joe, an orphaned delinquent who wandered the streets of the slums of post-war Tokyo. There he meets Danpei, a retired boxer turned drunk, drowning his sorrows in the middle of the street. After a rough fight, Danpei saw potential in Joe's aimless eyes, a natural talent for fighting. After going to prison, a sequence of events, and much convincing, Danpei managed to convince Joe to try boxing. This began a beautiful journey of Yabuki Joe's maturation, from an orphaned guy forgotten by God with no direction who only accepted boxing for Danpei's daily pay, to someone who fell in love with the sport and dedicated his entire being to the ring. And believe me, what these two men created without exaggeration is not only one of the best manga in history that still feels as fresh today, more than 60 years later, as it did at its premiere, but it's the best sports story in history. Period. No discussion. There's nothing to debate here. It's a perfect story, as tragic as it is beautiful, but that doesn't mean it forgets to have exciting, touching, funny moments, or ones that leave you thinking and reflecting on what it means to be alive, and the things one has to do to achieve what one sets out to do. It would be an understatement to say that Ashita no Joe was influential in Japan at that time. It reached the point where people called Ashita no Joe the Bible among university students of the late 60s. Joe was essentially the problematic hero who represented the struggle of the lower class, especially university students, who campaigned for a wide range of social issues like civil and political rights. The public saw themselves reflected in Joe and the trials and sacrifices he had to overcome to achieve his dream while discovering who he was as a person in a system that seemed to be against him and was designed so that he wouldn't achieve that tomorrow. By the 1970s, manga readers throughout Japan had turned the character of Joe into an icon. Ashita no Joe was so influential that on March 31st, 1970, the Japanese Red Army, a new left communist student organization, hijacked Japan Airlines Flight 351 as they saw a revolutionary message in the manga. During the hijacking, they shouted, "We are tomorrow's Joe." Fortunately, there were no victims of this incident, as the flight was only diverted from Fukuoka to North Korea due to the hijackers' demands, and the hostages and crew eventually managed to return to Japan. But there was a specific moment that really turned Ashita no Joe from a great manga series into a national icon, and helps demonstrate how gigantic this series was and is. A decision that shocked everyone when it happened, and a reception that was equally impactful, even for Shonen Magazine itself. You see that thing that's very normal nowadays, of celebrating things like anime characters' birthdays, or saying you have a waifu, or husbando, you know, fictional characters you'd want to marry. Well, all that culture of treating a character as if it were something real or semi-real can be traced back to Ashita no Joe, as it's the first instance of something similar happening, although perhaps not in the way you'd expect. I won't give spoilers or names, but if you've already seen or read Ashita no Joe, you know perfectly well who I'm talking about. Chiba and Kajiwara had a problem. They found themselves in a dilemma. One of the characters introduced early in the story was becoming extremely popular, possibly even more popular than Joe, the protagonist. Given enough time, this could become a real issue, as there was a risk the story would shift away from Joe due to readers' demands. One night, they sat in a bar drinking. Like many other nights, they had stayed up talking about where Joe's journey would go. They debated whether or not to kill this character, and that night, they made one of the most shocking decisions in manga history. In the next issue of Weekly Shonen magazine, fans learned of the decision Chiba and Kajiwara had made. They had chosen death. Readers and editorial staff alike were horrified when they witnessed the events unfold in that chapter, and it caused an enormous amount of public reaction. Again, for spoiler reasons, I won't say what happened, but it is a very impactful scene that, because of how it happens and what happens afterward, and also because it carries a lot of emotional weight, is very impactful and kind of disturbing. On February 3rd, 1970, the entire editorial staff was surprised to receive 10,000 letters from fans asking about the character's death. Chiba even got phone calls at his home from fans demanding to know what had happened. How did they get his number? Well, for some reason, one that neither I nor, apparently, Chiba understands, back then, the author's phone number and address were sometimes printed in the margins of the pages of the magazine. Like I said, don't ask me why. And to the fans' misfortune at the time, they would have to wait for their answer. You see, a mangaka's life isn't easy. You're dealing with tight deadlines, much stress, and little to no free time or sleep. Chiba was no exception. He survived on injections of different legal medicines, but after that chapter, his body couldn't take it anymore. Ashita no Joe had already been in publication for more than a year, was about to be the longest story he had worked on up to that point, so they had to hospitalize and operate on him since his duodenum was injured and he almost didn't survive, which meant a recovery period, which meant no new chapters of Ashita, no Joe for a while. In the midst of this desperation, on March 24th, 1970, approximately 1 month after the character died in the story, something very curious happened. Almost 1,000 fans gathered in real life, not to commemorate and give support to the person who for the last year had brought them their favorite story week after week, and who had recently been on the verge of death, but for the fictional character. Yes, they organized a funeral for the fictional character. This event was directed by Terayama Shuji, who was the host of the underground theater company Tenjo Sajiki. The service was complete with a photo of the deceased overseeing a boxing ring brought from Korakuen Hall itself, and included a standard reading of sutras and incense, as well as something less conventional, a 10 count on a gong. This was a very unique situation for both authors. Both had mixed feelings. In the car, on the way back from the event, the prideful Kajiwara, the same one who didn't allow anyone to change anything in his story, and who took a lot of convincing to work with another author, muttered, "It's exhausting to be a writer, but it's going to be harder from now on." And Chiba reflected on the responsibility he now felt as a writer. Joe and his friends had become not only a symbol of hope and resistance for an entire generation, seeking their own tomorrow in a Japan still healing from the wounds of war, but also friends. At that moment, both had the eyes of the world on them, but little did they know that would be nothing compared to what would happen the following week when the Ashita no Joe anime premiered and the series' popularity exploded. Ashita no Joe went from being a great boxing manga to becoming a symbol of hope for Japan. In the early 70s, and thanks to the anime, it was already a phenomenon among the working class and students, by realistically showing the lives of the marginalized and those forgotten by society. Joe trained in a shack in neighborhoods that were falling apart, surrounded by characters who, though portrayed with humor, reflected the daily struggle to survive of many people that Japan's modernization was leaving behind. In a Japan marked by social tensions, Joe represented the fight for a better tomorrow. But that connection so strong with the spirit of the times, showing how Japan's modernization that the Liberal Democratic Party had brought also led to its darkest and bloodiest stage, reflecting the anguish of an entire generation. While Ashita no Joe captured the hearts of Japanese readers with its message of struggle and resistance, the Japanese government had its own big ambitions. It was the 60s, and the country was experiencing what now is known as the Japanese economic miracle. Tokyo streets filled with automobiles, skyscrapers grew like mushrooms after rain, and the Japanese began traveling like never before. But there was a problem. Haneda Airport, built in the heart of Tokyo Bay, was getting too small. By 1970, according to projections, the airport would be completely saturated. It was impossible to expand it. It was surrounded by water and the megalopolis that grew endlessly. The solution seemed obvious. Build a new international airport. An airport that would not only solve the capacity problem, but would demonstrate to the world that Japan had risen from the ashes of war as a modern and prosperous power. A symbol of progress, of openness to the world, that the country was ready to receive the tourists who would come for the 1964 Olympics and beyond. And if you don't understand why this is a problem, there's a reason why Akira starts with an explosion at the Olympics, and it has to do with this. Just as Tetsuya Chiba had learned in his childhood, promises of a better tomorrow often hid painful betrayals. The government was in a hurry. It needed this airport operating quickly, and for that it needed land, lots of land. Initially they considered Tomisato, but when officials announced the decision at a press conference without consulting locals, the reaction was explosive. Again, no one asked the Japanese people, and they made a decision for them. But this time would be different. This time they wouldn't allow it. The farmers immediately organized into the Tomisato Yachimata Anti-Airport Union, and the protests were so intense that the government had to back down. Then, in a secret meeting between Vice Minister of Transport Tokuji Wakasa, the governor of Chiba, and the Vice President of the Liberal Democratic Party, they made a decision that would change history. They would move the airport 4 kilometers northeast to a place called Sanrizuka. The logic was cold and calculating. Sanrizuka had been part of the Goryo farm, imperial lands, since the year 700. After the war, these lands were sold to poor people, displaced by the bombings of Tokyo, you know, Chiba's mom's hometown, just like the residents of Doyamachi, the neighborhood where Joe and his friends live, which, funnily enough, is also part of Tokyo. So I think you can clearly see the connection there. The government thought that, given that these farmers had fought so hard to survive, a generous cash payment would convince them to move. They couldn't have been more wrong. This time, no one would make a decision for them, as had happened so many times before. This time, they themselves made their own decisions, regardless of the consequences. On June 22nd, 1966, when Prime Minister Eisaku Sato announced the Sanrizuka plan on television, the residents found out about it at the same time as everyone else. There had been no consultations, no dialogue, simply an announcement. Their homes, their farms, everything they had fought for during decades would disappear to make room for runways, which, as if to add salt to the wound, would serve to receive thousands of Americans and their products, the same ones who decades ago had destroyed their city. The response was immediate and furious. In July 1966, the Sanrizuka Shibayama United Opposition League against the construction of Narita Airport was formed, a name as long as their determination was deep. But these weren't just farmers protesting. Like Joe in Ashita no Joe, who found unexpected allies in the slums, the Sanrizuka farmers soon discovered that their struggle resonated with other marginalized groups. Opposition parties saw in this battle a perfect symbol of government oppression. University students, already radicalized by protests against the US-Japan Security Treaty, found in Sanrizuka a new cause to fight for. The message was clear: we accept support regardless of political faction. It was an impossible coalition: conservative farmers, urban communists, leftist students, nationalists, united by a single cause: that not a single plane would ever take off from Sanrizuka. And who do you think eventually became one of their emblems a few years later? Exactly, Joe. What began as peaceful protests soon transformed into something that seemed taken directly from a movie. On October 10th, 1966, when airport officials arrived with 1,500 riot police to install the first construction stakes, protesters tried to block the way with a sit-in. They were violently removed. But if the government thought that demonstration of force would make them back down, they were very wrong. Police violence only radicalized the movement more. The protesters abandoned nonviolence and began arming themselves with bamboo spears, fiberglass helmets, and US military radios. By 1968, what had begun as protests had become something more like a medieval war. Activists built fortifications, watchtowers, and underground bunkers. When 2,000 riot police arrived, they didn't find students holding hands, but people armed with blunt weapons, in organized formations, with defensive structures from which to retreat. It was literally a medieval siege in the middle of the 20th century. Police responded with water cannons and tear gas, but activists fought back with Molotov cocktails and glass bottles filled with a substance that, let's just say, didn't feel great on the skin. The most powerful symbol of this resistance was a 60-meter tall tower that protesters built directly in the flight path of the main runway. It was impossible for planes to take off with that structure there, and activists defended it like a medieval castle, building fortifications around it. For years, the tower stood defiantly, a closed fist of steel against the sky. Attempts to demolish it were met with rain of Molotov cocktails. Armored bulldozers had to push through the defenses, while protesters fought like desperate warriors protecting their last bastion. As in any war, there were martyrs. In 1971, during the Toho Crossroads incident, 3 police officers were taken out of this world at the hands of protesters. But the movement also lost its own. Fumio Sanomiya, a central leader of the youth division, ended his time on this planet in October 1971, leaving a note that said, "I detest those who brought the airport to this land, and I have lost the will to continue fighting." In May 1977, when police finally managed to control and demolish the tower, a protester received a direct hit to the head from a tear gas bomb and passed away 2 days later. In revenge for this incident, a police officer, the next day, in 1978, after 12 years of delays, the airport finally opened. But it wasn't a clean victory for the government. Just days before the scheduled opening, leftist groups broke into the airport, occupied the air traffic control tower, and destroyed equipment and installations. The opening had to be delayed another 2 months. When the new Tokyo International Airport finally began operating on May 20th, 1978, it was a symbol not of progress's triumph, but of its brutal cost. The government had won, but at what price? The airport that was supposed to represent Japan's rebirth had become a symbol of division and conflict. Unlike elegant Haneda, with its shopping mall atmosphere and observation deck, Narita felt sterile, surgical, militarized, as if it were a monument erected to commemorate a tragedy, because technically it is. For years, the tower stood defiantly, a closed fist of steel against the sky. Attempts to demolish it were met with rain of Molotov cocktails. Armored bulldozers had to push through the defenses, while protesters fought like desperate warriors protecting their last bastion. There's an increased police presence, a monument to fallen officers, and a partially demolished tower that still rises in the distance like a ghostly reminder of the battle. Farmers who never sold their land found themselves literally surrounded by the airport, which had to be built around them, forcing the farmers to create tunnels in order to move around. The most extraordinary case is that of the Shito family. Tuichi Shito rejected offers of up to $1.7 million for his farm. When he died in 1999, his son Takao inherited not only the land, but the struggle. Today, in 2025, Takao Shito continues living and farming in the middle of Narita International Airport, selling carrots, onions, and garlic in nearby markets. His farm, literally between a taxiway and a gate, is a daily reminder that even the most overwhelming progress can be stopped by the unbreakable determination of those who refuse to be erased from history. The connection between the Sanrizuka struggle and Ashita no Joe is no coincidence. Both were born from the same historical moment, from the same national pain, from the same desperate search for a tomorrow that was worth fighting for. Joe Yabuki fighting from the slums, the Sanrizuka farmers defending their lands with bamboo spears. Both represented the marginalized who refused to be invisible. Tetsuya Chiba had lived firsthand what it meant to lose everything and fight to survive. His experience as a refugee, seeing how promises of a home turned into nightmares, is reflected reflected in the pages of Ashita no Joe, and these in turn resonated with farmers who saw how promises of progress threatened to destroy everything they had fought for and steal their tomorrow. Perhaps that's why Joe didn't catch on in the West, because Joe spoke of a very Japanese experience, which the audience at the time may have had trouble connecting with. But who knows? The times they are a-changin'. Today, as many people in the West feel oppressed and marginalized, maybe it's finally time for Joe to take the spotlight once more.